It's a Saturday afternoon at Book Passage in the Ferry Building in San Francisco. A couple of dozen people have gathered for a book signing. The author is my friend and colleague Spencer Christian. If you lived in New York City in the late 70s as I did, or if you ever watched Good Morning America in the 80s and 90s, or if you live in Northern California, you'll know who Spencer Christian is.
6 to 16 till I could drive myself to school.
Weatherman at the legendary Channel 7 Eyewitness News in New York City. National TV personality on Good Morning America. Weather anchor at KGO Television in San Francisco. Son, brother, husband, father.
It was quite an experience writing this, I'll tell you.
And former compulsive gambler. He's written a book, an extraordinary story of growing up black in the Jim Crow South, launching a successful TV career, and nearly losing everything to gambling. What a story. I'm BJ Fennell, Spencer Christian, this time on Take Me Through It.
Take Me Through It is made possible by people like you. Thank you for downloading, listening, and subscribing. And leave us a comment on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing,
I'm
Spencer?
fine. Great.
Good.
Is this where I sit?
Yeah, you know what? Actually, I might sit there so I can listen to the...
That sounds good. No, it's been quite a week. And I've been very pleased with the... I never did. I never did send... I thought I'd reply to you. I wrote cool. I never even sent it. So I'll send it now.
Hey, Spencer, how you doing?
BJ, I'm doing great. It's been one of the greatest weeks of my life.
And why is that?
Because I feel an excitement about the response to my life story in my book and about the interest in it. And I just feel like I'm doing something meaningful and useful and purposeful and having fun while I'm doing it.
That's great. That's great. The book is You Bet Your Life, How I Survived Jim Crow Racism, Hurricane Chasing, and Gambling.
Yeah.
And it's hard to categorize your life, but for the book's purpose, that's what you've done.
Yeah.
Jim Crow racism growing up.
Yeah.
Hurricane chasing, part of your stellar television career, and then the gambling part of it. So
Yeah.
let's just take it from there. I'm going to let you sort of guide this conversation, Spencer, because it's really, I just want to hear what you have to say about the book and about your life. So let's start at the beginning.
Sure.
Growing up
Sure.
as a black child in Jim Crow, Virginia.
Yeah. Well, I felt for many years that I have stories to tell, life stories that are interesting, maybe even instructive, entertaining. And I've wanted to tell these stories for a long time. And many of them have to do with my childhood, growing up in the Jim Crow South. Many of them obviously have to do with my career, with the assignments I've had, the travels, the people I've met. I wanted to tell stories about parenting, about raising my kids. But during many of these years, I knew that I wasn't ready to tell the bigger story of my life, which included the nearly 30 years of compulsive gambling. When I finally arrived at a point just a few years ago, 5-6 years ago, where I decided I'm ready to confront this thing honestly and fess up to the world, then all the other stories started to, merge together. And so that's how I came to the point where I was ready to write the book. Now, should we talk about childhood?
Let's.
Okay. I had a happy childhood. I had a wonderful childhood, mainly because my parents were incredibly loving and supportive, and they had the ability to encourage me to look at the world with a positive view, even though I was faced every day, we were all faced every day, with mistreatment just because of the color of our skin, denial of just simple everyday rights that most people would take for granted. That kind of dehumanizing experience can destroy a lot of people's psyches and destroy their hopes, give them a very dim worldview. I became aware at a very early age that this was the effect that Jim Crow had on a lot of people around me. But somehow these two remarkable parents I had were encouraging me to honestly believed that I could overcome all that and achieve whatever I wanted and reach for the sky and, dream big.
Right.
And but they also taught me that if you happen to fail at something, it's okay. Just get up and try again. I know it sounds like a very simple, elementary kind of life lesson, but that's, I guess, how you teach kids when they're very young. And they also taught me that if I screw up, if I do something wrong, that as long as I'm honest about it and accept responsibility for my actions, as long as I'm accountable, that they'll forgive that and we'll move on. I won't be punished for it. So with that kind of foundation in my early life, there was almost no way I could not have reached for the stars and have dealt with the ugliness of Jim Crow racism and yet had a hopeful worldview.
I want to go back to one incident that you talk about in the book. As a white child growing up in New England, I never experienced discrimination. The history books have shown all of us about what it was like then with the colored-only water fountains and not being allowed to eat at the lunch counter. I've read about that. I've seen those photographs. I know about Rosa Parks. But I want you to tell me the story about something I never thought of. Clothes shopping.
Yes.
That is an incredible story.
Well, so in addition to all the other things you've enumerated there, going clothes shopping was kind of a disheartening experience because we'd walk into a department store like Sears or JCPenney or wherever people in our income level shopped in those days. And we knew that because we were black, we couldn't try on the clothes.
That's
if any
incredible.
item of clothing touched your body, then it didn't go back on the rack. You had to take it with you. So we had to hope that what we purchased was the right size and would fit properly when we got home. That was it. Now, there wasn't
no return policy.
no return
at all.
No return. No, not at all. Now, there were some rare exceptions, but generally that was the practice. One of the rare exceptions where I grew up, it was in Richmond, Virginia. We grew up out in the rural areas just outside Richmond, was this shoe store that was owned by a family with a Jewish name, a very common Jewish name like Silverstein or something like that. The men in that store treated us like they treated everyone else. We could go in there and try on shoes, multiple pairs of shoes. In fact, I don't even recall that there were separate restrooms in that shoe store.
Right.
And I began to recognize just by observing the world around me and reading and watching the news at a very early age that, in the Jewish culture, in the Jewish tradition, there's always been a great concern for human rights and social justice and all that. And I began to understand that. Oh, and I noticed also that the JCC, the Jewish Community Center in Richmond, allowed black kids to come in and play basketball or participate in whatever activities were offered, whereas we couldn't go to the public swimming pools or the public tennis courts. I know I've veered away now from the
That's
discussion
all right.
of clothing.
Your parents paid taxes, did they not?
Yes, they paid taxes. They
But
worked hard and they paid taxes.
And they couldn't use the public
Use the public facilities. Arthur Ashe, great Hall of Fame tennis player,
From
grew up in Richmond. That's right. And his family had to send him up north to live and receive tennis instruction because he was not allowed to play on the public tennis courts in Richmond.
Yet you have this natural talent that you developed that got you a job on television in Richmond, Virginia. Not an easy thing to do circa late 60s, early 70s.
It was 71.
71.
Well, actually, when I got the job and was offered the job, it was 1970. I began working on the air in 71, And that was only, 1970 was just 6 years after the historic Civil Rights Bill was signed into law. And only 3 years after civil rights legislation was being widely enforced and the barriers we've talked about started coming down. So, it was. it wasn't decades later; just a couple of years later.
Right, that's amazing. So, what was it like that first TV gig? What were the call letters? Which station was it?
WWBT.
Okay,
Excuse me.
That's right.
WWBT, the NBC affiliate in Richmond, Virginia, Channel 12, and even my first day on the job, BJ, I felt like I belonged. I didn't feel out of place. I didn't feel self-conscious. I don't know why I felt so comfortable. I don't know how to explain that, except that I wasn't the very first person of color on the air, but I was about the third. I was about the third person of color ever seen on the local news in Richmond, Virginia. And it had been just a few years. So once again, my level of comfort wasn't because many years had gone by and I felt like, people were used to to seeing an integrated newscast now. But I think it's because my focus was more on the work that I was doing and being an effective communicator than it was on being self-conscious and thinking color of my skin is different from everyone else's.
But not originally as a weather forecaster.
No. When I was in college in the late 1960s, actually from my early childhood, I was a news junkie, but especially during my college years, because there was so much going on in our society in the late 60s, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the women's movement. I was a political activist. I worked in campaigns, and I became so fascinated during the late 60s by the way the news media covered this profound change that was going on that I decided I wanted to be a journalist. Majored in English, minored in journalism, print journalism. So I began my TV news career as a news reporter. It was only a couple of years into my career that I started doing weather, and I was actually just asked to fill in on weather for a couple of weeks because our longtime weather person at that station had quit unexpectedly. And I had demonstrated a knowledge of the atmospherics of weather because I had done a lot of science reporting, in addition to other kinds of reporting. So I filled in for 2 weeks and had fun with it. We didn't have any calamitous weather during that 2-week period. So at the end of my 2 weeks of filling in, the general manager of the station called me in and said our ratings had gone up and I had become a hit. And the station wanted me to be its full-time weather person. And, of course, being a journalist,
right.
I resisted. I said, oh, no. I'm a news guy. I'm a journalist. And he explained to me how huge a pay increase I could receive if I agreed to do weather. And I said, I'm a weatherman.
How long did that take? How many tenths of seconds did that take?
Right. Exactly. A nanosecond. However, I mean, for several years after that, I still tried to tell people, don't identify me as a weatherman. I'm not just a weatherman. I'm a journalist. But that was a very fortunate shift in my career path because it featured me in a very visible, more prominent role on the news than most reporters are featured in. And I gained the attention of stations in bigger markets, and that's how I rose quickly to New York, to WABC. And then once I got to New York and to Good Morning America, I guess I worked for some pretty enlightened management because they recognized that I could do and should be permitted to do a lot more than weather.
And I think that's the extraordinary part of the story is that you breezily explain, I went from Richmond to WABC to GMA in less than 5 seconds, which is a career path that is unique in this business. I mean, you went from Richmond, Virginia to really the very, very top in a relatively short period of time.
Yes.
Years, not weeks, but years. That's extraordinary. That really is.
Let me throw in one other quick stop that was made on the way to New York. So I was in Richmond for about 3.5 years. And then the next, I should also point out that early in my career, I didn't want to stay in television news forever.
Right.
I wanted to gain the exposure I needed to run for Congress.
There you go. Well, hey,
but
never say never. I mean, you haven't been in news forever. Nobody has, or ever will, actually, when you think
exactly,
about it.
I know. But anyhow, after about 3 years on the air in Richmond, I was getting all these big offers from bigger markets. And I probably could have made the move right up to New York, but instead I still wasn't sure I wanted to give up the political dream. So I accepted an offer from a station in Baltimore, WBAL.
Okay.
And that was also an NBC station. So we moved there. My wife and I and our infant son moved there, and I was on WBAL for just a year when WABC in New York started calling.
Wow.
And that's when I said, hey, this TV thing might lead somewhere.
That's pretty good.
So so it was Richmond, Baltimore, New York. It all happened within about 5 years.
Right. And your life takes a turn, not just the big job at WABC, but as you say in the book, that's where you first started to play poker.
That's
first time.
Correct.
You were 30 years old or so?
Yeah, I arrived in New York just before I turned 30 at WABC.
Had never been in a casino, had never really played cards.
No. Never had. We had a little poker game at WBAL just during the last few months I was there, Friday nights after the 11 o'clock news, and I found it kind of exciting. So when I got to New York and I heard the guys there talking about a Friday night poker game after the 11 o'clock news, I said, oh, I know how to do that. Right. So that's how it started. Had never been into a casino, had never been to Las Vegas, and even at that point, we're talking 1977, even the casinos in Atlantic City had not opened up yet.
Right.
So poker was the first form of gambling in which I engaged.
Mm-hmm. And how does the story progress from there? Not wanting to give away everything, in the
Right.
book. We want people to go buy the book. We want people to
Exactly.
read the book because it's an extraordinary story. So we don't want to give too much away.
Right,
However, we want to give people a taste of how your life progressed and how it came and ended up with you writing a book about it.
Okay. Well, so the Friday night poker game began as a fairly friendly Friday night poker game after work, and everyone would show up with $200 or $300, and on a typical night, you could win or lose a couple of $100. But it quickly grew into a cutthroat game, and the stakes were elevated. And after 3 or 4 hours of playing, it might be 2 o'clock in the morning, and most of the players wanted to go home, but the losers would say, no, let's play another hour. I want to get my money back. And it morphed into an all-night game with higher stakes, and within a few months, I found it easy to win or lose $500, $600, $800, maybe even $1,000 in one night. When I would win, I can't even describe how exciting that rush of adrenaline was. And then I couldn't wait to get home and get 2 hours sleep and get up Saturday and treat my family to all kinds of fun stuff. On a losing night, it was depressing because I would stay there all night, play till 7 o'clock in the morning. When I'd get home, my wife and my young son, Jason, would just be getting up, and I would feel guilty for not being as engaged as a husband and father should be. And then a year later, 1978, casino gambling came to Atlantic City.
Right.
I made my first trip to Atlantic City with a poker buddy of mine for a weekend of fun. And I walked into the casino. There was only one initially. And it was like Fantasyland for grown-ups. There were bells and whistles going off and lights flashing and all these stimuli coming at you that triggered this feeling of excitement and anticipation. So I played. There was no poker in the casino at that time. I played blackjack. I played roulette. I played the slot machines. I played craps, and that's basically how I got hooked on the thrill of gambling.
And then it progresses. You get to GMA, and again, now you start traveling the country with some wonderful opportunities to cover big stories and to meet with world and national leaders and very famous people. So how does that progress? How did, balancing again the fame and relative fortune of working on a national morning news show with trying to balance this need, I guess, to gamble.
So by the time I arrived at GMA, I had filled in on GMA a lot during the years I was on WABC on the local news, but by the early to mid 80s now I was becoming full-time regular on GMA and had all these travel opportunities you mentioned. So on a typical week, I would be sent out on a Thursday after the morning broadcast to a broadcast destination, a remote location for the Friday broadcast. And by this time, I had become a high roller in the casinos of Atlantic City and Las Vegas. I was getting all the VIP treatment, the luxury suites, and all the pampering that goes with being a high roller. So that was just almost as much a narcotic for me as the thrill of gambling itself. So after every Friday remote, virtually after every Friday remote, if I had found myself in a location west of the Mississippi River, I would fly to Las Vegas right after the broadcast and spend Friday night there and come home on Saturday. If my location was east of the Mississippi River, I would fly into the Philadelphia area and take a limo to Atlantic City and spend Friday night there gambling. That was the pattern for years and years and years. And
winning or losing, same pattern.
Winning or losing,
Right.
Same pattern. Winning or losing. the only difference in the pattern between winning and losing is that after a winning visit, if it was a big winning visit, if I won a significant amount of money, let's say $10,000 or more, I was usually able to walk away without feeling the urge to rush right back the next week to gamble some more.
Right.
But the urge would still be there, and I would still go back within a couple of weeks or 3 weeks. But after a losing trip, if I lost $10,000 or more, then I was desperate to get back to the casino. Couldn't wait for the next weekend so I could go there and get the money back, chase my losses. And that's a very common problem that gamblers have.
You write in the book about hitting rock bottom.
Yeah.
But not just once.
Yeah.
Several times.
Yeah. Yeah. You would think that after hitting rock bottom once, I would have learned, or any rational person would have learned.
And what was that like? What did you mean by rock bottom?
Oh, well, the first rock bottom was occurred in 1984-85. I had fallen behind on federal income taxes. Actually, it wasn't just a matter of not having paid enough. I had invested in some exotic tax shelters and claimed all these losses. But I didn't save the money. The money that I saved from taxes, I had lost in gambling. So when the IRS finally audited me and disallowed all these losses I'd claimed on these tax shelters, I was already in a lot of gambling debt. I had bought a home. I was paying mortgage. I was paying tuition for my kids to go to private schools. And now all of a sudden I was hit with this tax liability of about $300,000, and they wanted payment right away.
Oh, wow.
The assumption was that because I was a high-profile person with high earnings, I must have had hidden assets somewhere. Well, I had no hidden assets because all my money had been, all my extra money had been lost to gambling. So when I couldn't pay and tried to demonstrate my inability to pay right away, I proposed some kind of a settlement. Let me pay you $10,000 a month or $20,000 a month. IRS wouldn't take that, so finally a guy in a dark suit like something out of a movie showed up at my house and from the IRS and tacked a notice on the front door of my house saying this property has been seized by the Internal Revenue Service for failure to pay federal income taxes.
For all the world to see.
For all the world to see. For all my neighbors to see. For the kids who went to school with my kids to see. So I had to move my family out into a rental property. I mean, we moved into another nice house, but it wasn't one that we owned. And my kids came home from school. Well, my son was old enough to, at that point, he was about 10. So he was old enough to hear kids talking about, his dad is Spencer Christian, the guy on TV. They lost their home. My daughter didn't hear any of that, but she would hear us talking about it at home. And it was a humiliating experience, which I had brought on myself.
Right.
Yeah.
And at the same time, there you are, TV star.
Yep.
The happy, really good, energetic
Yep.
Spencer Christian every morning for the entire country to see and basically enjoy watching.
And it's hard to explain how it was I was able to maintain that, because that was real. You can't fake that. I mean,
Correct.
Yeah, I had this horrible thing going on in my life that was very stressful and caused a lot of anxiety, and yet the two things in life that gave me great joy were my family and my job. So when I arrived at work, even though in the back of my mind I was thinking about how to deal with this issue with the gambling and the tax problem and the debt, once I arrived there and got focused on work, my spirits were elevated and my smile and my joy that I projected were genuine. When I went home from work and my kids came up and gave me a hug and I sat at dinner with my wife and kids, I derived great joy from that. But on those quiet moments at night when I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep and trying to figure out also how to deal with this situation and how to climb out of it, those were the depressing moments.
Right. And you declared bankruptcy.
Oh, yeah. I declared bankruptcy.
1987 or thereabouts.
Yeah, it was 84, 85, right after we lost that house. Yeah. That was the first of two bankruptcies.
We'll get to that in a second. And let's talk about Good Morning America.
Yeah.
And let's just talk about some of that experience that you had. And again, some of the people you met.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about in the book, the subtitle includes the term hurricane chasing, which, trust me, I've seen that coverage. I've never actually had to do it myself. I'm the guy who says, go out and chase the hurricane.
Right.
And staying inside the comfort of some television station somewhere. Deep in the Midwest, not having to worry about the hurricane hitting us.
Yeah, you're one of those guys, one of those
sure,
producers.
I was for
I used
many years,
to
yeah.
occasionally, if I was in a really uncomfortable situation because of weather conditions
Right.
on the air, I would say it's colder than a producer's heart where I am.
Producers have a heart? I didn't know that. That's good to know.
Well, a cold one.
Okay.
Of course, it was part of my job to not only forecast weather conditions, but to go out and report from unusual and catastrophic conditions. And there were many assignments like that. I had 14 hurricane assignments while I was at GMA, and on several of those assignments, the storms were coming onshore just as I was going on the air. So there was the dramatic effect of the howling winds and the gusts over 100 miles an hour and debris flying all around me and my holding on to a utility pole to avoid being blown out of the camera frame. It made for good TV, and there were times when I felt I was in a little bit of danger, but I wasn't frightened enough to say I'm not going. So that was the hurricane chasing part. I was in floods, blizzards, even earthquake coverage, even though it's not a weather event, but it falls under, I guess, the umbrella, no pun intended.
Right. I want to talk. Well, let's do a quick tease for
Okay.
the book here, because there's a brilliant event that you did at GMA. Spencer goes from north to south.
Oh, yes.
Maybe we'll just leave it at that, because it's a great story about TV and it's hilarious. And I think that's a great tease for people to actually read the story, because first of all, I thought to myself, why didn't I think of that over more than 30 years in television news? The north to south. Week was just brilliant.
I'm so thank you so much. I'm so glad you read that and enjoyed it. And you're right. I won't give it away.
Don't give it
but
away.
Just to add
It's
to the
too good.
tease, the producers at GMA enjoy putting me in situations that were unusual, just to see how I would handle them.
That's a kind way of putting it.
Yeah, and I enjoyed that too, actually, because they trusted that somehow I was going to deliver good TV for them. So it was a compliment. But on this particular assignment to which you refer, Spencer's great north to south adventure, you cannot even begin to imagine how challenging my situations were. But I'll hope for the readers to read that.
And we'll find out how much you love cold weather.
Yeah, you certainly will.
It was more than just weather, though. You met
Yeah.
some extraordinary people that had absolutely nothing to do with weather, whether it was an on-air interview or some behind-the-scenes meetings. And you know, let's talk about two people that you met in the green room.
Yes.
Duke Snyder. Let's
Right.
talk about him first, and
Okay.
then let's talk about Richard Nixon.
Okay.
So let's start with Duke Snyder. It's a great story.
All right, Duke Snyder was one of the three greatest center fielders in Major League Baseball in the 1950s, and they were all in New York. Willie Mays with the Giants, Mickey Mantle with the Yankees, Duke Snyder with the Dodgers.
That's the song, Willie, Mickey, and the Duke,
That's it,
right?
Willie making the Duke, exactly. And I was a Brooklyn Dodger fan, and Duke Snyder was my childhood hero. I collected baseball cards, and I knew all of his stats, and where he was born, and all this sort. So now, fast forward from the 1950s in my childhood to about 1990, 91, somewhere around there. Duke Snyder was appearing on Good Morning America as a guest to talk about how aging athletes had to sell memorabilia in order to, make a living. They didn't make the big bucks back in his day.
Right.
So I couldn't wait to go into the green room before the broadcast to meet Duke Snyder, because I wasn't going to be part of the interview. He was going to be interviewed by Charlie Gibson. So I walked into the green room excited to meet the Duke. And at that point, he might have been about the age I am right now, about 70. When he stood up, he still looked physically fit and strong and strapping, and he had that silver gray hair for which he was known. And I was about to introduce myself before I could speak a word. He said, "Spencer, you're my favorite. I was looking forward to meeting you." And I wept. I mean, this was my childhood hero. I was going to go over and say something to him like, "Hey, Duke, I'm Spencer." And, I didn't have to, there was no introduction was needed. He had been a fan of mine for years and was as excited to meet me as I was to meet him.
That's extraordinary. That's extraordinary. And now, sometime later, I guess,
Sometime later,
Richard Nixon.
"I am not a crook. I am not a crook. A crook is something you get in the neck. And I'm not anything in the neck."
To many people, he was.
Right. Okay, so at this point, BJ, I had met several presidents, had either interviewed them or met them on some occasion. Richard Nixon was scheduled to be interviewed by Charlie Gibson. I knew I wasn't going to be involved in this segment, so once again, I was on my way to the green room so I could say I had met another president. I walked in. He was sitting there. This was just a few months before he passed away.
Really?
He was not in good health at that point. He had a frail appearance. I approached him. I extended my hand, and I said, "Good morning, Mr. President. And before I could get my name out, he said, "Oh, I know who you are." And
This is why I made you tell the story. The imitation is priceless.
it's too bad this is a TV, right? I could do the jowls and all that.
No, the voice, you nailed it. You nailed the voice.
So I started talking to him about baseball because I used to take my kids to lots of New York Mets games at Shea Stadium. And we would often see Richard Nixon up in the owner's box with Fred Wilpon. So I knew he was a baseball fan. So I began talking to him about baseball. How about this Mets? What do you think of their chances this year? And as we talked baseball, this frail old man began to come alive. You know, he became energized and his posture straightened up. And once I knew he felt comfortable with me, I decided to tell him a true story, but it poked a little fun at him. And here's the story. I said, "Mr. President, in 1960, when you ran against John Kennedy for president, I was in the 8th grade, and our civics teacher chose 2 students to do a mock presidential debate. I was Richard Nixon. The other kid was John Kennedy. I won the debate, and you lost the election." And he went, oh. And he did a belly laugh. And all of a sudden, I realized, and people who witnessed it realized, I made Richard Nixon laugh, a man who was not known for his humor.
Not a side of him that many of us or anybody ever saw, whether in person or certainly not on television. That's a great story. Thank you for obliging. I had to make you tell that story.
I love this story.
That's right. Your time at Good Morning America evolved and came to an end.
Yes.
Late
1990, at the end of 98, beginning of 99.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. And so you, no, it's just the way television programs evolve.
That's right.
And so you came to KGO here in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And that was 1999 or
1999, yes.
And so where was the gambling? What kind of gambling were you doing at that point as you made that transition from network to local television? Where were you in your gambling life?
Well, in the last couple of years at Good Morning America, 97, 98, I was at the highest point of the high roller experience, playing, gambling, really high stakes, playing mainly craps and blackjack. But I also, by this point, had opened up credit lines at probably 14 casinos, including Las Vegas and Atlantic City. And after having had a string of losing visits to these casinos, I found myself owing $20 to Casino X and $20,000 to Casino X, $50,000 to Casino Y. And the way casino credit works is that you go in and you sign what is called a marker, and you take out the amount of cash or chips that you are allowed under your credit limit. And if you don't pay that off within 30 days from the date you sign it, that marker is deposited in your checking account as a check. And I certainly didn't want my bank or people at my bank knowing the level of my gambling debt or anything like that. So for years and years, I don't know how I found the energy to do this. I would go from casino to casino to casino, whether it was Vegas or Atlantic City, whenever these markers were due for deposit. And I would, pull together enough cash to go and pay off a marker and then take it out again just to float it for another 30 days.
Right.
And this is the game I was playing at the time that that I left GMA and moved to KGO in San Francisco. Well, it became much more challenging for me to keep this house of cards from collapsing on me once I moved here because I experienced a very sharp reduction in income from what I was making at the network to what I was making when I came back to local news. So my budget was tighter. I was also going through a divorce, which was from my first wife, which was painful and expensive. I had fallen behind on taxes again for the second time. So here I was making less money, owing a lot of money, paying alimony, trying to settle with the IRS, and trying to avoid confronting the credit managers at these casinos and saying, "I can't afford to pay you, let's settle." And the reason I was trying to avoid that is that they're hard to settle with. They usually want full payment at once. They don't want to do installments. And there were so many of them. It wasn't like I had to go to just one casino. There were 14.
Right. Right.
That was one of the lowest points in my life, perhaps even the lowest, because I didn't want my marriage to end, but it wasn't my choice. And now I was 3,000 miles away from everyone and everything that had been dear to me for many years, because my kids were still living on the East Coast. They were growing up, but they were still on the East Coast. And I was no longer at the greatest job I ever had, which was at Good Morning America.
Right.
And now I'm facing all these challenges and all this difficulty.
And this led you down the road to bankruptcy again.
Yes, it did. And here's what that bankruptcy accomplished, because I want to make it clear that I'm not being defensive here, but I want to explain that, first of all, it was a humiliating experience for me to go through any bankruptcy, especially a second bankruptcy. It goes against everything I believe in, all my values. I think you should always honor your obligations. In this second bankruptcy, I didn't get rid of my regular consumer debt, the banks I owed and things like that. Most of those debts were secured, so I had to pay them anyhow.
Right.
This bankruptcy also did not get rid of the tax obligation. You can't get away from paying taxes by declaring bankruptcy. And it didn't eliminate the alimony. All it eliminated was the casino debt. And I reached a point where I guess my attorneys convinced me that you don't have to feel guilty about stiffing the casinos, because look at all they've taken from you. I mean, of course, when I say they've taken, I
Right.
willingly gave it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not saying I was a victim. So that helped me feel not so bad about the second bankruptcy. But it did attract media attention. My second bankruptcy, was written about in the National Enquirer, the Star. I had to appear at a hearing in the bankruptcy court and stand up in front of 200 other people who were going through it and answer questions about my income and the casinos I owed, and I was, of course, a recognizable person, so there was a lot of whispering and pointing. It was a horrible, horrible experience.
Was the gambling still going on as this was happening?
At that point, it was not. That's a great question. I'm glad you gave me a chance to address that one. About a year before that second bankruptcy, I actually found the courage to contact every single casino credit office and say, look, here's my situation. My salary's been reduced by about 45%. I'm paying behind on taxes. I want to settle. I want to pay you, but I'm going to have to do it over time. What happened was some of the casinos to whom I owed the higher amounts of money, like $40,000, $50,000, said, okay, we'll take $5,000 a month or whatever. The ones to whom I owed the smaller amounts, $10,000, $12,000, $15,000, filed judgments against me and served me papers here at work in front of my colleagues.
Wow.
So I, at that point, once I contacted them all and said, let's settle, I stopped gambling, because it was, I didn't have to run and try to keep all this stuff in balance anymore. And I didn't gamble again for a couple of years. So I went through the bankruptcy and got rid of the casino debt, made a settlement with the IRS. Now that pressure is gone. And I thought I was done with gambling for good. So for 2 years, I didn't gamble at all. Now the bankruptcy is behind me. I'm beginning to feel like my self-esteem is coming back. And a friend of mine who lives and works in Las Vegas was having his 50th birthday party and sent me an invitation. So I went to the party thinking that I could handle it, that I could go to Vegas and it would be all right. And by this time, I had developed a relationship with the woman who is now my second wife. Mm-hmm. So she went with me to be my babysitter. But I decided after the big party, I want to go into the casinos and see what it feels like. So I went in and played a little bit of blackjack and played a little bit of craps at a low level, not high stakes. But I knew as I was doing it, it was going to suck me in. I was going to let it suck me in again.
Right.
Yeah.
But eventually,
Yeah.
it was like a two-step process, the end of your gambling days.
Yeah.
It started first with your daughter telling you that she was going to have a baby.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was step one. And then step two happened when the child was born. Walk me through that.
Okay. Well, I like to say that I was saved by love. Okay, my kids, my daughter in particular, because she was able to have more, I guess, candid conversations with me about the gambling problem than my son. But my kids had been concerned about my gambling for many years. And many other people who loved me and cared about me were concerned. So that's why I say I was saved by love. But this is around 2012, just as I was thinking I was about ready to quit. My daughter said, Dad, I'm getting married soon, and I'm going to bring grandchildren into this world. And is this the role model you want to be for your grandchildren? Do you want your grandkids to grow up knowing their grandfather as a gambler? And she went on to say, you have wonderful qualities that I love and admire, but I hope you'll get this thing under control and get it out of your life before I bring grandchildren into this world. Actually, I did stop gambling before my first grandchild was born. But that was the clincher. That conversation with Jessica, my daughter, just kind of put everything in focus for me. And there were other things going on that contributed to my ability to quit and to my recognition that I don't want this in my life anymore. But that was the deciding factor right there.
And so you wrote a book about it.
Yes.
Why would you write a book about it? To relive some of that, just some of the desperation and, as you described it, humiliation. Why would you write a book about that?
BJ, I think I needed to write a book about it because I needed to do a cleansing confession. That's what I felt I was doing as I wrote the book. I wanted to say to the world, to my family, to God, this is what I've done. I take ownership of it. I'm not a victim of anyone else's actions. I brought this on myself, and I'm changing the course of my life. That was one reason for doing it. The other reason was I wanted to share the story with the world. I wanted people to see that you can hit rock bottom and you can rebound and recover and rebuild your life, and you can repair damaged relationships. I really genuinely want my story to be a source of encouragement and hope for people facing all kinds of problems, whether it's addiction or something else.
No Gamblers Anonymous, though. Really, you've licked this on your own.
Yeah, I have. I tried Gamblers Anonymous, and I don't want the fact that I didn't stay with it to sound like I'm diminishing how important how important that agency is. Gamblers Anonymous helps lots of people. I went to a series of meetings over a period of about 8 weeks, once a week, and I just didn't get what I felt I needed to get me to the point where I was losing the desire to gamble. But so, when I say I did it on my own, I mean, I did it without an organized or established program. But I've been a person of faith all my life, so prayer has always played a foundational role in my life. I'm not trying to evangelize the world here and say that my way is the way you have to choose. But, I pray every day and I talk to God about it. And I reached a point in my life where I said, I want you to take away this desire, take away the feeling, the pleasure that I've derived from this and make it so unpleasant for me that I want to give it up. That was part of it. Part of it was, but saved by love. I felt that God loved me, but I also knew that my kids loved me, and even my ex-wife loved me and cared about my well-being, and now my new wife cared about me and loved me, and all of these people who cared about me were encouraging me and supporting me and saying, you can find the strength to do this. So all of that led to my feeling one day, you know what? I don't have the desire to do this anymore. I really want it completely out of my life, and I want to share my experience and my story with the world and let that serve as an example to people that even when you think you've hit rock bottom and life is hopeless, it's not hopeless. You can bounce back.
Would you indulge us and read one paragraph from the book?
Which one do you want me to read?
Start there, and then it just does a line or two
on
the next page. Right from there, and then it does turn... I'll just have you pause for a second.
Okay.
Here. So there, and then you flip it over, and it's like 2 sentences on that. Right.
Oh, yeah. Got it. Here's why I'm sharing my story. I want my life to serve as a source of comfort and inspiration for people facing challenges and difficulty of any kind. No matter where we come from or what station we achieve in life, no one enjoys perfect peace. No one is without worry, fear, pain, anxiety, or self-doubt. Everyone experiences sadness, heartbreak, failure, embarrassment, and uncertainty. In many ways, the human condition is frail and flawed. Yet, in many other ways, the human spirit is strong, resilient, hopeful, and resourceful. On the surface, my life may read like a storybook version of the American dream. A poor black kid from the Jim Crow South overcomes untold hardship and adversity and rises to prominence as a high-salaried national television personality. He makes his parents proud, provides a comfortable life for his family, and is recognized every day by adoring fans. He probably has no idea what it's like to feel powerless, worthless, invisible, or insecure, right? Well, if you've arrived at this point in the book, you know that's not true.
That's great. One final question. Are you a recovered gambling addict or recovering?
I feel that I'm a recovered gambling addict. Now, psychologists and people who specialize in treating addiction will tell you that if you're an addict of any sort, that you're never recovered, but you are always recovering. That's probably true in a broad sense, but I think it's probably not wise to look at addiction or any similar condition in black and white terms. There are gray areas in our lives, and I think I'm recovered. I know people who have quit drinking, who are alcoholics, and they can't walk past a bar without feeling a little urge. I have friends who quit smoking, and if they see someone else smoking, they feel the urge. I feel no urge, no desire. I feel only revulsion at what I did to myself, my family, almost to my career through my gambling. I have been to Las Vegas since I quit gambling to attend a friend's 90th birthday party, which was held in a restaurant in the Venetian Hotel. So I had to walk past the casinos and the ringing bells and the flashing lights. There was not one part of me that wanted to indulge in that. So I consider myself recovered.
That's terrific. And how's the book been received by not just the general public, but by your family, perhaps?
That's a great question. But the general public has responded in a very positive way. Oh, this is I can't believe what you went through, and I find this very helpful. I admire your courage and all that sort of thing. And those are nice things to hear. My two children, my son and my wife, and my daughter, my ex-wife and my current wife, have both had mixed emotions about it. They are proud of me for what I have done, for my honesty and openness and candor. But in reading the book, it took all of them through the emotional experiences they had during my darker days. Because this book is not only about my life, it's about their lives too. So it was a roller coaster ride for them emotionally to read the book. But they're proud of me, and they're happy that I've done this, and they recognize that it has been a cathartic experience for me, and they are hopeful, as I am, that it'll be helpful to other people.
The book is You Bet Your Life, How I Survived Jim Crow, Racism, Hurricane Chasing, and Gambling by Spencer Christian, weather anchor here at KGO TV in San Francisco. Spencer, thank you very much.
Thank you, BJ.
It's a great read, and Spencer is just one of those genuine good people it's been my pleasure to work with in the broadcast industry over all these years. Check out the book, You Bet Your Life by Spencer Christian, published by Post Hill Press. Thanks for listening and for downloading and for telling all your friends about us. I'm BJ Fennell, coming to you from beautiful Sausalito, California. Join me next time for Take Me Through It, a production of Fennell Communications, LLC.